Well. Let's see. We've got our. Hey guys, welcome to the Lion Zone. I'm trying to get my music going here. We had a little technical difficulty. So I'm your host, Steve Johan. And I like to say, be the lion and not the prey, where you learn to be a lion and not the prey. In a world of hungry jackals and vicious wolves, I'm your host, Steve Johan. For more about me, visit Steve Johan at stevejohan.com and find me at stevejohan.substack.com. I've got another great show and a great guest for you today. But to start things out, I do have some music that's going to work for me to set the theme, and here we go. All right. So, Tom, do you know who that might be?
It sounds like the soundtrack from the movie Gettysburg to me.
Well, it is a soundtrack, and it's actually Jerry Fielding, main title for Outlaw Josie Wales, 1976. One of my all-time favorite movies, I should say westerns, in my top 10 westerns. And that movie itself is going to be a little picture of what we're going to talk about today,
Yeah.
because it's an alternative view of history as we know it. So I want to welcome my guest, Tom DiLorenzo, and he is the president of the Mises Institute. He is the former professor of economics at Loyola University, Maryland, and a longtime member of the senior faculty at Mises Institute. He is the author or co-author of 18 books, including The Real Lincoln, How Capitalism Saved America, Lincoln Unmasked, Hamilton's Curse, Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government, The Problem with Socialism, and The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. You can find him at Mises.org. I'm going to have all this stuff in the description. And thank you for coming on with me, Tom.
Sure, my pleasure.
So tell me, what got you started on your journey to looking at life and history in a different, well, what brought you to where you're at today? What was your wake-up calls along the way that really caused you to say, what I've been told is not true, I need to research myself, and then ultimately, you ended up at Mises. So tell me a bit about yourself and your story.
I'm the president of the Mises Institute, and I've been associated with them for over 30 years. It's been around for 42 years. We're here in Auburn, Alabama, and it's a free market institute that has programs regarding free market, Austrian school economics, peace, and free enterprise is our themes. And as far as my career, I'm an economist. I've got my PhD at Virginia Polytechnic Institute way back before they changed the name to Virginia Tech. Once they got a good football team, they changed the name to something more footballish and less engineering, less like an engineering school. But I got interested. I guess you're interested in how I got interested in history, economic history, because I had a career in sort of straight economics before that for 25 years. And I had a hobby. Civil War history was my hobby. I was just fascinated with what would motivate men to do what they did. Not just that war, any war, but especially the American Civil War. And I got to thinking how I could combine my profession, economics, with history, my hobby. And I had gone on battlefield tours. I'd read dozens and dozens of books about all the battles and all this. And I went to a Smithsonian lecture series that had all the big shot Ivy League historians of the Civil War give talks. And I started asking them, well, what book can I read about Lincoln's economics? Every president has an economic policy agenda. And so I wanted to learn some of that because I had studied all the battles and the generals and all that biographies and that's all that thing. And they kept telling me about this one book called Lincoln and the American Dream by Gabor Borit. He was a professor at Gettysburg College, and it had statements in it like Lincoln was in favor of protectionist tariffs his entire life because he wanted the common man to have a chance at prosperity like he had had a chance at prosperity, which is total BS. Protectionist tariffs harm the common man. They raise the price of everything that the tariff is imposed on, and they force the common man to pay higher prices for the food, clothing, and anything else that's the tariff is on. And so that really piqued my interest. And so I started investigating this, and I discovered that Abraham Lincoln spent 25 years or so in politics before becoming president, exclusively devoted to nothing but economics. And he was an advocate of high protectionist tariffs on imports, a national bank run by politicians like today's Fed, and what we today call corporate welfare, government subsidies. In his day, it would have been to railroad corporations. He was a big time railroad lawyer. He was the general counsel of the Illinois Central Railroad. He represented all the big railroads in the Midwest. He was offered the job of the general counsel of the New York Central by Erastus Corning, which
Wow.
he turned down because he was making so much money doing other things. And so he traveled around the Midwest in a private train car, courtesy of the Illinois Central, with an entourage of Illinois Central executives at his feet. And that's who Abraham Lincoln was. And so for 25 years, that's who he was. And so I'm supposed to believe, as someone who grew up in Pennsylvania and was taught the same thing that everybody else is taught, that this had nothing whatsoever to do with why he was the nominee of the Republican Party, which was at the time was the party of big business, and had nothing to do at all with that, with why he was elected or what he did when he was elected. And so I just smelled a big fat rat there. And that's how I got into writing 3 books eventually over 20 years about Lincoln. And the first one was The Real Lincoln.
Wow. My family and I spent some time last year on a road trip, and we got over to Springfield and we visited the Lincoln Memorial, and we went to see the house that he lived in, all these things. And of course, by this time, I was already well aware that our history was not what I've been taught.
Yes.
So, uh,
I've been
but
there.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I find it very interesting. But so let's step into this because we're going to get into the Mises Institute a little later on
Okay.
in the show. But I really want us to step into, before we even get into the war. I was writing some notes and I was asking myself, what took place in America between 1812, the War of 1812, and the War of Aggression, the Civil War? Because that's a time span that, to be honest, I have not spent a lot of time in history. I found it boring when I was a kid. Now, as an adult, I'm reading books and trying to dig in. But something took place from 1776 to 1812, and then from 1812 to the time when the Civil War took place. So can you go back and kind of explain a little bit about what was going on here in America at that time?
Well, to this day, the basic conflict in politics in America is the same, basically, very much the same as it was in 1789. You had the Hamiltonians, who were the big government people of the day. That, by the way, is why the New York leftists had this big play on Broadway about Hamilton. They discovered that he's the real founding father of big government in America. That's
Wow.
why he's the new big hero, and that's why they denigrate Jefferson so much. And so the conflict in American politics, the basic conflict, has always been the Hamiltonian view of government is never energetic enough. Government always needs to be doing more, versus the Jeffersonian view of that government is best, which governs least. Those are Jefferson's own words. And so the Jeffersonian view won out after Hamilton was the secretary under George Washington. And his party basically, one of the first things they did was to outlaw free speech with the Sedition Act. And they arrested journalists. They arrested a member of Congress from Vermont named Lyons for merely criticizing President John Adams, who was a Federalist like Hamilton. And so we had this tyranny imposed by people who had just signed the Constitution, supported the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so, but as soon as they got power, they threw the Bill of Rights down the toilet and passed the Sedition Act that basically made it illegal to criticize the government, and that caused the end of the Federalist Party. And Jefferson became president, and this Congressman Lyons, who was from Vermont, who was put in jail by the Adams administration for criticizing John Adams. In Congress, he referred to Adams, who was kind of a fat guy. He called him his rotundity, and that was, and apparently Abigail Adams could not stand that, and so she had her husband put him in jail. So Jefferson is president for 8 years, and then James Madison for the next 8 years, and then James Monroe. So all the Virginians, who were all pretty much Jeffersonians, were in charge, and up to the Civil War, the Jeffersonian viewpoint prevailed more or less in American politics. And it was Hamilton who coined the phrase the American system, which was picked up later by Henry Clay and then by Lincoln. And the so-called American system was protectionist tariffs, a national bank run by politicians, and corporate welfare. But it wasn't the American system. That was the rotten and corrupt British system that the Revolution was fought to escape from.
Yeah.
And it was, and so a very sly sort of propaganda move. Hamilton coined it the American system, but it wasn't. It was the British mercantilism, as it was known in the day, but run by Americans without the British. And so for all during that time, there was proposal after proposal for protectionist tariffs, to bring back a bank, and they had some success with that. But Andrew Jackson vetoed the bank, the rechartering of this bank, the first central bank. It was called the Bank of the United States in the 1830s. And so they did have some success for a while, but then that bank was abolished. And we no longer had a central bank as of that time. And then corporate welfare, they had almost no success with that. The state governments fiddled around with corporate welfare and subsidizing road building or canal building. And it was such a disaster. And there was so much corruption and nothing got built hardly, that by the time you get to the Civil War, every state, with the lone exception of Massachusetts, had amended its constitution, not just pass a law, amended its constitution to prohibit the use of tax dollars for any corporation for any reason at all, because they had such horrible results. And Abraham Lincoln was one of the leaders of this in Illinois. He got the Illinois legislature in 1837 to spend some $10 million supposedly on road and canal building. Not a single job was finished. The state went deep into debt, and it took decades for the taxpayers of Illinois to pay off that debt, and they got nothing for it. But a lot of money was spent, and a lot of people made that money. A lot of the contractors and of course they were politically connected. That's how they got the contracts. And so it was a gold mine for Abraham Lincoln as the leader of the Whig Party in Illinois. He got to dole out $10 million to his political supporters, and that helped build his political career in Illinois. And it sent a message to the rest of the Republican Party when the Republican Party was created in the 1850s that, well, this is our guy, and he knows how to play the game. And he was a wealthy railroad lawyer. like you said, I was in Springfield, and that house of his was the biggest house on Old Aristocracy Row. There's a big sign there that says Old Aristocracy Row. Lincoln lived in the biggest house there, and I did go to the Presidential Museum. It was a very impressive place. Joseph Stalin would have been very impressed with
Oh yeah.
a monument of that sort to him. He was very jealous, I would think, and so that whole period, it was really economic policy was front and center, but it was over this battle between the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians, and president after president after president vetoed all of this. Jefferson said you need to amend the Constitution to do this. Madison said the same thing. The very last thing James Madison did as president was veto a piece of legislation that would have provided tax dollars to finance road and canal building. He said it's not in the delegated powers of the Constitution, so you need to amend the Constitution. James Monroe did the same thing. John Tyler, 1840, John Tyler becomes 1841. John Tyler becomes president. He turned out to be a Jeffersonian because the elected president was William Henry Harrison, and he was a Whig. And the Whigs under Henry Clay at that time thought they were finally going to succeed and put all of this into place. And then Harrison dies 1 month after he was inaugurated. And John Tyler turns out to be a Jeffersonian from Virginia, and he vetoed all of this. And this is 1841. And so the Whigs threw him out of their party, and they burned him in effigy in front of the White House. They threw an adult tantrum, in other words, over this. And so by the time you get to the Civil War, we had the lowest tariff rate of any time in the 19th century. No federal money was spent on corporations for anything, and there was no central bank. And that all changed. In the Civil War, we had 60% average tariff rates that lasted for 60 years after the war was over. We had the massive corporate welfare subsidies to the railroad corporations that led to the immense corruption of the Grant administrations after the war. It's called the Crédit Mobilier scandal, and we could talk about that if you want. And so we had protectionist tariffs, corporate welfare, and they did nationalize the money. They created the greenback dollar, and at the time there were competing currencies, and they placed a tax on these other currencies that competed with the greenback dollar. For example, there was a bank in New Orleans that issued money that had 100% gold reserves, which its money was based on. So if you took a $10 bill to the bank, you can get $10 worth of gold. You could redeem it. And it was very, very reliable money. It was so popular. It was used in Minnesota, even though the bank was in New Orleans.
Wow.
And it was called, the currency was called the Dix, D-I-X. That's 10 in French, because they issued 10 Dix notes. And that's where the word Dixie comes from, Dixieland, the land of Dixie. It's because of this bank in New Orleans. So there were competing currencies, but they were priced out of the market by Lincoln's taxes. And the Secret Service was created to police competition with the greenback dollar.
Oh,
So
you mean
it wasn't created to protect the president. It was created to police the sort of the legalized monopoly in money that the federal government gave itself.
wow? So the infamous TV show, The Wild Wild West, he was in the Secret Service, but really what he was doing was he was protecting the banking conglomerates.
That's right. Yeah.
Just like the CIA now does for
business.
the CIA of today does the same thing. Our military does the same thing. They protect the banksters. I mean, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, there's a famous essay, famous among certain circles, called "War is a Racket" by General Smedley Butler. He's said to be the most highly decorated Marine Corps general in history, and we're talking early 20th century. And after he left the military, he wrote this little book, "War is a Racket," where he basically said, "I spent my whole career making money for this bank, this corporation, this company, that company, in Nicaragua, Cuba, wherever the government sent him. It's what it was, Hawaii. It's what it was all was about. It wasn't about defending America from any foreign threat or anything like that. It was using the power, basically corporate welfare at the barrel of a gun.
Yep, yep. I wrote a book myself, and I'm now actually rewriting it and going to publish it for myself. But in there, I say two books you need to read to understand the banking and the war machine is War is a Racket and Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You read those two books,
Yeah,
and you will now understand
yeah,
in two volumes how the world really works and what DC uses our military
yeah.
for.
Yeah. And by the way, right at this moment, the Mises Institute, where I'm at, I'm the president of it. We are in the process of giving away 100,000 copies of the book "What Has Government Done to Our Money" by Murray Rothbard. You go
Mm.
on our website, mises.org, Mises.org, and you can see there's a place there where you can sign up and have, if you want 10 books, request 10 books, and we'll send them to you. And so it's "What Has Government Done to Our Money" by Murray Rothbard, who was a great economist, and it's very clearly written, clear as a bell, and it's a great little education on money.
Oh, good. I'm going to get one, and I want all my listeners to do the same. I'll put a link on, well, the links there. But so let's. I have read about I did some research on railroads. This is 20 years ago, 20 years ago, just reading about them, and that's when I came across articles of, the barons would load up their private train cars with politicians, prostitutes, and booze. And they'd go out
Mhm.
on a 3-day bender and they'd come back, and then those politicians would be happy to vote for the railroad to get their right
Yeah,
of way to go right through the middle of America, and with the help of Union soldiers, basically subdue anybody in their way.
yeah. Yeah, that's what happened. If you want to read a book about Lincoln and the railroads, there's a book called "Lincoln and the Railroads" by John W. Starr, Starr. And like I said, he was a railroad lawyer for many years before he became president. Uh, and yes, he grew up in a log cabin, but everybody on the American frontier grew up in a log cabin.
Yes.
So you're supposed to think, oh, poor old Abe Lincoln, he grew up in a log cabin and it was so cold in the wintertime. Everybody did. They didn't have McMansions back then. It's so silly. That's probably the silliest and most ridiculous part of all of American history teaching is the whole Lincoln story. But on the railroads, yeah, a good book on that is by Burton Folsom, The Myth of the Robber Barons. He tells the whole story about the subsidies to the railroads and what they did. And you're right, the government subsidized railroads, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific, were given per mile subsidies, and so that gave them an incentive to build a lot of miles. And so when I used to talk about this in my economics classrooms, I taught a course called American Economic History. I would write a map I would draw a map of the United States on the blackboard and then put like a bowl of spaghetti in the middle. And that's what the railroads would look like, because any member of Congress or politician anywhere who said, "I'll vote for the subsidies if you run a line to my town," even though if his town had maybe 2 customers per month for the railroad, that's the cost you had to do. And then I would find the actual route. You can go online and find the actual routes, the railroads lines of these, and I would put it on the screen for the students, and it would look like a spaghetti. And then I would compare that to a man named James J. Hill, who built the Great Northern Railroad beginning in Minnesota, and it was unsubsidized. He even paid the Indians for right of way, paid them in cattle or whatever they could trade for, whatever the Indians wanted, he would trade for them. Whereas the government subsidized railroad would call in the army to kill all the Indians, and
Yes.
that was a form of. And they ended up, by the way, killing some 45,000 of the Plains Indians, and they must have maimed 2 or 3 times that many, maimed for life. And then the remaining they put in concentration camps called reservations. Uh, and that lasted from 3 months after the end of the Civil War until 1890, 25 years.
Yes.
The Plains Indian, the war of genocide on the Plains Indians. But in one of my publications, I quote General Sherman himself as saying the purpose of that was, quote, to make way for the railroads. And all that killing, and all that, the women and children included. They would bomb entire villages and would not discriminate. Sherman told his generals, it's too time consuming to discriminate between women and children and the braves, and so don't bother. And that's the virtuous U.S. Army that it had all that virtue built up after the Civil War, and that's what it did with it. And so yeah, they made a lot of money, and you're right, they would bring politicians out there. And it's also one of the reasons for the eradication of the buffalo, the American buffalo, is that they were out there on the open range, but and people could sell the buffalo skins. So yeah, you had people going out there wildly shooting hundreds a day to get the pelts and do that. But it was also a part of the strategy to kill off the Indians. And
Yes.
so the government orchestrated it because the Indians used the buffalo for everything, the Plains Indians, food, clothing. They even used the tiny bones for fish hooks. If you do any reading about this,
Yeah.
everything. In the cold winters in that part of the world, they would gut a buffalo and put the newborn baby inside the carcass to keep it from freezing to death. And they eat everything. They lived on the buffalo. And so the US government said, okay, we understand. So let's kill all the buffaloes. And so any Indians we don't shoot, we'll starve them to death and or cause them to freeze to death. And that was the plan. So that they contributed greatly to the eradication of the great buffalo herds in America. And it was all to make money for the railroad corporations.
Yeah, when you go down the rabbit hole of corporate government, that's fascism. I mean, there's just actually just Marxism, fascism. I don't even, it's capitalism on steroids without free enterprise. It's
Crony
it's
capitalism.
crony capitalism
Yeah.
because what James J. Hill, and that's where my research was leading to, is I read a book on him and I was amazed. And you're right, it was all private, and he did the Northern Pacific, and
Yeah.
he was able to do it on a private funding.
Yeah,
And
he had private investors. He hired an engineer who found the passage through the Rockies that Lewis and Clark had found in 1803. We're talking 1870s here. No one else had found it since then. This man found it, and it cut 100 miles off of James J. Hill's route, which was money in his pocket. I mean, the fastest route to the West Coast, and that's what he was all about. And he reveled in underpricing his competitors, his heavily subsidized competitors, by the way, who had an unfair advantage because of that. But at the same time, they shot themselves in the foot because in order to get the subsidies, like I said, and like you said, they had to run all these wasteful lines to where Congressman X lived, and to his town. It was uneconomical. And so at one point, they were all bankrupt, and James J. Hill was not. He was thriving. The
you know,
Great
it's
Northern,
the
which still exists, by the way,
what's that?
the Great Northern
Oh,
Railroad.
yes, yes. It what I find interesting is what truly started with the railroad is now pretty much across the board for
Yeah.
most all large and small corporations. They're all subsidized by the government. They have big wastages, big losses. Um, I mean, the boondoggle of the green energy and all that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
trillions of dollars over the last 20, 30 years of nonsense. But every industry, Tom, I kind of estimated if we were to really cut the military down, let's say down to a quarter of its size, shut
Mhm.
down the military bases offshore, really just protect our borders, that probably overall, probably 50 million people or more in the United States would be without a job because
Yeah.
all the corporate contracts and all the contractors and all the people who support those people and all it that we're not the country that our forefathers at the signing of the Constitution planned, are
Yeah.
we?
Yeah, well, those people would get productive jobs. They would be forced to get jobs in businesses that actually serve consumers rather than these jobs. as far as that goes. We had a conference here at the Mises Institute several weeks ago. One of the speakers was David Stockman, who was President Reagan's budget director, and he gave a talk about the military budget. And he said, had we, Iraq, for example, had nothing to do with 9/11.
Of course not.
And of course not. Afghanistan, even if bin Laden was there for a while, we were there for how many years, Afghanistan, and a lot of American soldiers died in Afghanistan and Iraq. And he had the numbers on the medical expenses, billions and billions of dollars, because all these soldiers had come back maimed psychologically and physically for life for the rest of their lives. We have to pay for that. And he said, had we just not gone into Iraq and Afghanistan for all those years, the amount spent on these medical bills would have been about 1% of what they actually are. We would still have had some medical bills for the veterans who need help, but it would be almost nothing. And you're talking tens, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars, definitely hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 20 years or 30 years, because these were young men in the military. And they come back and they're going to live a long time, but they have medical issues for the rest
Yep.
of their lives. And so, and that all started with Lincoln. And so, that period of history you alluded to, from the War of 1812 to the Civil War, it was a political battle. And then we had a shooting war that settled all that.
Yeah.
And another thing that settled, by the way, is that, we had judicial review before that, but it was the general thinking that the president has an equal view as the Supreme Court on what's constitutional, as does the Congress, and as do the people of the states. When Andrew Jackson was told by John Marshall, the Chief Justice, that the Bank of the United States, the first central bank, was constitutional, he basically said in his statement, "Thanks for your opinion, but my opinion is different, and my opinion is just as valid as your opinion." And so we didn't have this idea that 5 government lawyers with lifetime tenure would tell us what our freedoms are to be, all 330 million of us. That's preposterous on its face when you think about it.
Yes.
But up until then, it was understood that we all had a voice in this. That's why a lot of states, if the government would pass a law that they thought was unconstitutional, they would nullify it. New England nullified the War of 1812. Basically, they didn't participate. And they thought it was a dispute between Jefferson's party and the British, and they didn't participate. And so Wisconsin nullified the Fugitive Slave Act, which compelled Northerners to run down runaway slaves. They said, that's unconstitutional in our opinion. We're not going to enforce that. And then South Carolina nullified a tariff in 1828, the tariff of abominations, they called it. They said, we think this is unconstitutional in our opinion. We're not going to enforce it. And they even voted to give the governor, this is like 1832, $160,000 to buy guns with which to defend against federal tax collectors should they show up and try to enforce the tariff.
Wow.
And so, but then what the Civil War ended was federalism and states' rights were pretty much destroyed. And we established a monopoly of constitutional interpretation among 5 government lawyers with lifetime tenure, the majority of the Supreme Court from then on. And the old Jeffersonians had always warned that if that day ever came when the federal government itself is the sole judge of its own powers, it will inevitably decide that there are no limits to its powers and we will live under a tyranny. And so here we are.
Nothing happens overnight. It's a long progress to regress. And what so many people died for and worked for and scrounged for hundreds of years prior to the War of Independence was lost within a scant 50 years.
Basically the government, everything government touches eventually turns to crap. I used to have I used to have quotation on my office door at Loyola University in Maryland, a quote from Ringo Starr, and it said, "Everything government touches turns to crap." I thought students would get a kick out of it because it doesn't come from some economist, some egghead. It comes from
Right,
Ringo Starr.
right.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about what took place. I have when on a previous trip and with my family, we do these long road trips, and we flew out and did the last one was the Midwest. So we flew out and started in Minneapolis and went all the way down, ended up in Dallas. The last one, the one before that, was fly out to North Carolina, go into Tennessee a little bit, back into South Carolina, and do all the southeastern states, and then end up in Dallas. And what I discovered when we went through the South is a different spirit than what I live here in north of Seattle. And this is my home. That's where I've grown up in Washington State. But I noticed in the South there's a different spirit. I saw it when we landed. No one was wearing masks, and it was all done. And this was in 2021, whereas in Washington it was still
Oh yeah.
And then we started going to historical sites. We started doing our tours. We started just walking through areas. We spent a time in Vicksburg, and we stayed at a place called Duff Green Mansion. If anybody gets a chance, please go there. And they had a gal that we part of it's a big bed and breakfast thing. It was a mansion built in the 1850s by a guy who made his living off of cotton, basically brokerage.
Mhm.
And then we heard the history, and it got turned into a hospital during the War of Vicksburg. And that was the only reason why that's the only building and a church next to it that were survived. Everything else was leveled.
Mhm.
And then I found out that every city of importance was leveled,
Yeah.
except for Savannah and others, which were shipping ports. And I had no clue that everything had to be completely rebuilt. Everything. And it
Yeah.
took decades and decades and decades of rebuilding because the money and the income and the loss was so devastating. Talk to me and talk to our audience about what really took place after that war. It was horrendous.
Well, during the war,
During the war, please,
they,
yes.
they waged war on the southern civilian population from the very beginning. Uh, uh, there are many books about this. You're not taught this in school. You have to do your homework. You have to go read up on it. But Charleston, South Carolina, for example, when there was no Confederate army there were days where there was over 1,000 artillery shells would rain down on Charleston. When General Sherman got to Atlanta, there was no Confederate army. The Confederate army had left. There were only women and children and old men left. For 4 days, he personally supervised the bombing of all the buildings wherever they would see activity, human activity. They would target those buildings, and knowing it was all women and children. And his chief military engineer was a Captain Poe. He said there's no military advantage to doing this, mass murdering women and children. And Sherman's response was to say, "It'll make the war come to an end quicker if they'll surrender, if they know that we're murdering their women and children once we get into their cities." And this went on all over Georgia and South Carolina. I moved here. I'm in Auburn, Alabama now. The Mises Institute is in Auburn, Alabama. I'm sitting here in my office. I could be standing in front of the famous football stadium in 5 minutes. So we're right across the street from the football stadium at Auburn University. But I moved here from Bluffton, South Carolina, right next to Hilton Head Island. And the Civil War, part of the Civil War took place there. All of South Carolina was decimated when Sherman went through there. And every house in Bluffton was burned down, every house, except one or two right by the dock. There's a big river called the May River there, and that goes into the ocean. and that was used as the Union Army headquarters. But every other house in town was burned down, and these are civilian occupied houses. There was no army; there was soldiers there, and that's what the U.S. government did during the Civil War. And these were not invading foreigners; these were fellow American citizens. And Sherman was such a disgusting and despicable human being that when he got to Mississippi, where he used to live, he made it a point to go to his old neighborhood and burn down his neighbors' houses that he knew. When he was a banker, before the war in Mississippi, and so that's the kind of person that he was. And of course he was in charge of the Indian Wars for 25 years after the Civil War. So all the mass murder of the Plains Indians, he was at the top of the chain. He was the commanding general of all of that for all those years, and that sort of thing went on all throughout the South. And there were even here in Auburn, there was a museum in Auburn. There is a museum in Auburn. They had an exhibit of what Auburn looked like after the war, and there were pictures of vast miles and miles of the territory around here, where all you could see was of the brick chimneys of where a house once stood, because the houses had all been burned down, and all that was left was a brick chimney from the ground up, and they called those Sherman's sentinels. Sentinels a guard, somebody who's guard duty and sitting straight up. And that's what they called them at the time. But that's the sort of thing that happened. James McPherson, who's a Princeton Civil War historian, one of his books, he said probably 50,000 Southern civilians were killed. And that was at a time when the population was about 1/10 of what it is today. So if you standardize that to today's population, 500,000 be like the U.S. government killing 500,000 Americans in 3.5 years. And I think that 50,000, by the way, is probably a gross underestimate.
Yeah.
And it was indiscriminate. It was the slaves, anybody, women, children. And you drop 1,000 bombs on Charleston. A bomb is a bomb. They didn't send sharpshooters into Charleston.
No.
They bombed them from Charleston Harbor, and when there were no soldiers there. And that's the sort of thing that happened. Some towns were totally destroyed and never rebuilt. And there are plaques throughout the South of where a town once existed here, and they never bothered to rebuild a lot of these. And it took the South the sort of the average income of the North versus the ratio of the average income in the North, the average income in the South. It took about 100 years for that to get back to where it was in 1860.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the gal said that Vicksburg did not celebrate 4th of July for 100 years.
Yeah,
because it coincided when they had to surrender. And I mean, and it's like, well, people have no clue. So we're looking at Israel doing the same thing with Palestine today, and people are in arms.
I'm waiting for Netanyahu to start quoting Lincoln.
Yeah,
they usually do that.
Isn't that interesting? And they did the same thing when you look at every war that's ever been fought. It's there's no good war. They're all fought and they destroy civilians. Civilians are the first casualties, the end casualties, and then it goes on for decades and decades to rebuild. And so my question to you would be, before the War of Independence, there was the Great Awakening, the Great Awakening, when there was a religious fervor, and it really got people's minds thinking of in a different direction, and the opportunities, and it kind of set the motion what took place next. But again, between that and what took place in the War of Aggression, I call it Civil War, there must have been an about face of irreligiosity that entered into the North that would allow these individuals to be so ruthless. Because I've read a little bit about what General Lee had talked about, some of his thoughts, but in some of the other Southern, they were very religious.
Yes.
But
Stonewall Jackson was extremely religious. He sent a part of his paycheck in the army he sent home because his wife was maintaining a program they had to teach slaves how to read the Bible, and so he was a very religious man.
So
Yeah,
talk to me about
yeah,
maybe if you even have thought about this. I'm a follower of Christ, so I'm very in tune with the spiritual warfare and physical warfare, and I think at times when mankind falls, they fall, and then the other entities enter into their minds and just cause them to go
yeah,
pink haze, and they have no feeling, no
yeah,
compunction, and they will destroy their fellow man without any thought, with
yeah.
literally no thought. It just becomes this vindictive hatred towards their fellow man, and yet they were neighbors maybe a week prior.
Mhm.
So have you ever thought about any of that?
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me of when Ron Paul was running for the Republican nomination. He addressed this convention of evangelical Christians, and he reminded them that Jesus Christ is known as the Prince of Peace. And he got booed, loudly booed by the entire crowd because they were all warmongers. They were all, let's kill all the Iraqis, let's kill all the Afghans in Afghanistan. There's nobody more bloodthirsty than the Southern Baptist leadership people, as far as that goes. But I think what happened, though, you're right. There's a different type of religion, Christian religion in the South than there was in the North. The North, the Puritanism was still very powerful, and the Puritans always had this idea that they were sort of God's chosen people. You could read some of their writings, and that gave them the right to dominate other people.
Yes.
And there was also a lot of post millennialism, where they believed that they had to create a kingdom of God on earth first before they could go to heaven. And
Yes.
that meant the eradication of sin, including the sin of slavery. And so while all the rest of the world ended slavery peacefully, including Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, there were slaves everywhere. The slaves built the slave ships in Boston Harbor, Newport, Rhode Island, New York Harbor. That's where the slave trade took place. That's where the ships sailed from. That's where the ships were built. They used slaves to build the ships in New York and Boston and Rhode Island. And so, but they all found a way, once slavery became uneconomical in the North, they found a way to end it peacefully, like the British did, the French, the Danes, the Dutch, everybody, and the Northern United States, except for Lincoln. Yeah, that we couldn't do that with Lincoln. And part of the support for this was the followers of John Brown, who literally said, "The hell with Jesus Christ. This is our new God." I can dig up quotes for
Oh,
you of
wow.
prominent New Englanders who literally said, maybe not those exact words, but that. There's a historian named Thomas Fleming who wrote a book about this, and he quotes Henry David Thoreau and prominent people like that saying that. They were crazed supporters of John Brown, who was a mass murderer. He went out in the Midwest and started just killing people who were not slave owners. Right? He enjoyed it. He was like a Charles Manson type person, but he pretended he was all slavery was the justification. But the first people he killed was a mother and father in front of their children, and they were not slave owners. And so he's like I said, he was a Charles Manson, and that's the people these New Englanders picked as their new god. And then one of the songs that they sang while they were pillaging, plundering, raping, and burning their way through the South was John Brown's Body. That was the song that they sang. There's a song called John Brown's Body, and so I guess they thought they were taking revenge for the fact that the U.S. Army, by the way, when John Brown was captured at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, Colonel Robert E. Lee is the one who captured him. And he was still in the U.S. Army at that time, of course, as before. And by the way, Lincoln's first choice to be the commander of the Union Army was an Italian military man named Garibaldi. Garibaldi had worked for the King of Italy in conquering southern Italy. All of southern Italy was known as Sicily at the time, not just the
Mm-mm.
island of Sicily. all of southern Italy. And it was the wealthy part of Italy. It's where all the gold was. Garibaldi took an army down there. This is before the Civil War, the American Civil War, conquered the South, took all the gold back to the North. And so Lincoln said, "That's my guy." And he literally offered Garibaldi the job of commanding general of the American army. Garibaldi turned him down, and his second choice was Robert E. Lee. He asked General Winfield Scott, who was the senior general in the army, too old to do the job at the time, and he said Lee would be your man. And of course, Lee famously said, "I can't wage war on my own people, my family, my relatives are in Virginia." And Virginia originally voted to stay in the Union, by the way. It wasn't until Lincoln launched an invasion with 75,000 soldiers into the South that Virginia took a revote and voted to secede. But they originally wanted to stay in the Union.
My mind just reels when we talk about when you're sharing this information. I just, I, I heard about the Puritans, and I haven't read a lot about them, but my brother-in-law is a missionary, and he said, "Oh, Steve, the Puritans would be more than they were more than happy to torture the Native Americans,
Yeah.
to try
Yeah.
to say, hey, a
Mhm.
little pain now is better than eternal pain later." And I'm
Yeah,
like,
there's always an
that's
excuse.
that's
Yeah.
I'm like, then that passage that says Jesus says, "Many will say on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not?" And I'm like, and then he
Yeah.
says, "Be gone from me, you who practice lawlessness." And we, so that spirit of that hardcore Calvinism, that hardcore uh, Puritanism, the this we are God's people, this is our right. I mean, you hear the same thing going on in Israel today. We're Zionism, we're God's people. They don't even follow God. And
Jewish supremacists.
Jewish
Yeah.
supremacist.
Yeah.
It's the same mold. German
Yeah.
supremacy, the same mold. The British supremacy did it before them.
Yeah.
The
British.
every empire. Yeah, people don't have a go back and start reading the bloody history of Britain. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
they
There's, well, I'm here at the Mises Institute, and Ludwig von Mises was named after a famous 20th century critic of socialism. He wrote a book called The National Economy. It was in German first, and then translated into English. And he talks about all these same things, and he points out how the sort of the imperial governments, whenever they were conquering other places, they would always conquer what they called the lesser races. They would
yes.
feel that they were superior to whoever. Even when the U.S. government invaded the Philippines and took over the Filipinos had just gotten rid of the Spaniards in the Spanish Empire, and the U.S. government comes in and says, "Well, now you're going to become part of the U.S. empire. You thought you got away from that," and the Filipinos did not want that, and so
No.
they fought a war, and they killed, according to the historians, some 200,000 Filipinos. And I've read some of the history of this, and the same thing. They had members of congressmen and senators talking about the Filipinos as though they were savages. And one of my papers that I wrote about this, my academic articles, I quoted a member of Congress saying, "We will go over there and Christianize the Filipinos." But at that point, the Filipinos had been Catholics for about
Ex-
400 years.
Yes.
Yeah, and so we're going to Christianize the Filipinos. This is a man who's making the case for murdering hundreds of thousands of people, and he is going to Christianize somebody. That's and that's government for you, but our government is guilty of that in history and historical episodes, and a lot of other governments as well, like you said.
I the United States, in some ways, now you have the South and the North, and we don't even think, quote quote, of that ideology anymore. People move from point A to
Yeah,
point
yeah,
B.
yeah.
We don't have that. The pain and suffering is kind of a in the past, but we have a constant war machine called the U.S. military that has never stopped since World War II. I mean, they
Yeah,
have never stopped. It's
yeah,
like we could have had the greatest prosperity throughout the world and the greatest peace and the greatest um, expansion of knowledge and technology, and really bringing all groups together, every group together, in the sense of equalizing, in the sense of allowing equal opportunities for all these various countries to rise above. And yet that was not part of the NATO alliance. It was to continue to keep a strong thumb on anybody who would go against their empire. And
Yeah.
we haven't seen true peace because it is the same. It it cycles. It's just
Yeah. Yeah. There's a book called America Invades. I have it on my bookshelf here somewhere. That's why I turned around. I can't remember exactly where I put it, but and it has a list of all the places where the U.S. military has gone since the 1700s, and the list, the table that lists them, is about 5 pages long, single spaced. Of all these places all over the planet, we've been constantly invading somebody, almost constantly since 1789. A very few years that we weren't invading somebody. And there used to be a bumper sticker that I saw around in town that had an American flag on one side, and it said, "Do as we say, or we will bring democracy to your country." And because it's always done in the name of democracy,
oh
and everybody's supposed to say, "I surrender." It's democracy, and then they see how our elections are stolen or the vote fraud. That's what they want to bring here, and that is what they bring there. That is what they bring to Ukraine. We overthrew the government of Ukraine,
yes, we
the
did.
duly elected government of Ukraine.
Yes.
At the beginning of before all this war.
Was that back in 2007, 2008? I think
Yeah,
that
something
took
like that.
place.
Yeah,
Yes. And
yeah,
and more and more people are coming to wear this. There's a lot more
yeah,
things. I
yeah,
tell people that the internet has become the great equalizer. It has
yeah,
allowed teenagers to grandparents discover things that they never knew. They could listen to this show
yeah,
and they go, I had no clue. I need to do investigating. They can listen to another show. They can listen to
sure.
another show.
Yeah,
They can, there's archive.org. You can go there and find books that you won't find anywhere else.
yeah,
And you start reading them, and like 150 years ago they were writing about this and they were telling
yeah,
us this was already going on. I had no clue. Well, it was
yeah.
all buried. You've been tarred and feathered at times because of your views and your
Oh yeah,
writings,
yeah, yeah,
because you don't follow in line with the victors write the history and the victims
yeah,
suffer for it. Talk to me about how, and I think you actually did. You talked about Hamilton being the the opposite of Jefferson, and how
yeah,
his teachings have basically become what we have today.
yeah.
We do not have Jeffersonian
Oh no, yeah,
republic.
yeah, yeah. We still have glimpses of it here and there. With it's such a big country. The government doesn't have enough bureaucrats to
Thank you.
police all of us. So
Right.
that's the freedom that we have to do as we please, and by ignoring government as much as possible. And so yeah. And well, Hamilton, yeah, my book Hamilton's Curse. He invented the whole idea of implied powers of the Constitution in a debate with Jefferson over the constitutionality of a central bank. Jefferson said the Constitutional Convention actually discussed this and they voted it down. They said they did not want a government-run bank, and you'd think that would be enough evidence that it's unconstitutional, and it's not in the Constitution. And Hamilton basically said, "Well, you need to read between the lines, and then you'll find a reason for it." And he used the necessary and proper clause to say that, well, yeah, there are these delegated powers in the Constitution that are the powers of the central government, the federal government. But in a bank run by politicians is necessary for these to take place. And Jefferson responded by saying, "No, no, it's just convenient. It's not necessary. We have banks. If we want to deposit the tax money, we have banks. You don't need a bank run by politicians." And But that idea that there's are implied powers, that
Implied
was the end. That
powers.
was the end of the Constitution. That was the beginning of the end of the Constitution,
It's a
because
living document.
you
It's
go along with
implied.
that, and it's whatever any politician imagines is constitutional, and which is where we are today, and we have been there for a long time. And that's one of the things that Hamilton was responsible for. And of course, on economics, he was a British mercantilist. He wanted to bring the rotten British mercantilist system to America without the British. And when I used to give talks on this about my book, Hamilton's Curse, I would say that if you ever saw the movie History of the World Part Two with Mel Brooks portraying the King of France, his laugh line was, "It's good to be the king." You know, who would object to that? Like somebody would bring a pallet of gold bars at his feet, and he would look right into the camera and say, "It's good to be the king." And so Hamilton, I tell people, Hamilton, that was his thinking, that if you're on the paying end of a mercantilist empire like the British Empire, it's not so good. But if you're in the money collecting end, it's a good thing. It's good. And so Hamilton and the Federalist Party, they wanted to be the string pullers of this big interventionist, big government empire that mimicked the British Empire. And he wanted more war too. He wanted a war with Spain. He would have wanted another war with England, and that's why Jefferson imposed a trade embargo, because the alternative was another war with England, because England was at war with France when Jefferson was president, and they had been kidnapping American sailors and then conscripting them into the British Navy, and so Jefferson was put behind the eight ball. And what can I do? A war is the worst. Another war is the worst possible thing. So he had a trade embargo, and he knew it wouldn't last forever, but because the war would end eventually with France, and so that's what he did. And the New Englanders, by the way, nullified the trade embargo. They didn't enforce it, because like I said, in those days, there wasn't a Supreme Court that made the final decision. The citizens of the states were thought to have an equal say in what's constitutional and what's not.
So then let's talk about how, because you're in economics, let's talk about the role of the Federal Reserve, which is a private bank, and the World Bank and the International Monetary Foundation, and all these guys who I personally believe kind of pull the purse strings
Yeah.
of every country, because the old adage, the debtor is a slave to the lender, and every country out there, as I know, are all debtors to these banks. And there's some idea that, well, we can just keep paying off the interest, but seems to me you don't want to be a debtor. You want to, if you do get debt, you use that to expand, let's say, your enterprise, and you get enough money to pay back, like when you buy your mortgage or whatever. But talk to me about that, about how now they're printing money out of thin air, loaning it by the trillions to our country, other countries, and saying, well, this is what we want you to do. This is how we need to do it, to allow each country to continue to expand and spend money they don't have. Talk to me about those roles.
Yeah, well, it's legalized counterfeiting, basically. And the chairman of the Federal Reserve is appointed by the president, so it's not 100% private. It benefits private individuals and institutions and bankers especially, but the people who run it are political appointees by the federal government. And so what they do is they create money electronically just out of nothing, and give it to by buying government bonds back from banks like Chase Manhattan or whoever. That's how they put the money into they'll credit Chase Manhattan with $2 billion in return for some government bonds. And the government bonds, by the way, so they own these bonds, and the principal and interest that is paid to the bond owner, the Fed, is how the Fed pays its own salaries and its perks and everything. So they have an air force of Lear jets, and they own all this property everywhere. They pay themselves lavish salaries. They travel all over the world on private jets and all that. And there was one and they've never been audited. There was one government accounting office report on some aspects of the Fed about 30 years ago. It made it into the Wall Street Journal. And one of the memorable facts that came out, this is 30 years ago, the head janitor at the Fed building in Washington, D.C. was being paid $163,000 plus benefits back 30 years ago. And so even the guy, he's the head janitor. So he just sat in an office and said, you clean the toilets today and you go sweep the parking lot. And he didn't actually do janitorial work. And he made that kind of money. And so so what that means is that creating inflation, price inflation, it's the excessive printing of money that creates it, price inflation that you and I suffer from because everything we buy costs more, actually benefits the Fed bureaucrats because that's how they get more money in their budget. And so that's the racket that we live in. And so, and of course, with the prices, when prices go up, everybody who works for a living, their wage, their what we call the real wage, goes down. That is, you have to pay more for the same stuff, groceries and gasoline and everything else. And so it's a pay cut, and it's also it's called the inflation tax, and it's regressive because if you're working at a job that pays 25 or 30,000 a year, and the gas goes up by 48%, which it has in the last 3 years,
Yes,
it's going to hurt you more than it's going to hurt a Donald Trump or a Joe Biden.
that's right.
As far as that goes, it's going to be a much bigger pinch on you. And so that's called a regressive tax. It imposes a bigger burden on the lower income people than higher income people. And that's what inflation is. And of course, the Fed, by printing all this money, it allows the government to claim that we can get something for nothing. Because, for example, the Ukraine example, if the government were to say, okay, we're going to spend another $100 billion in giving it to these criminals in the Ukraine,
Which are, by the way, are buying these massive yachts and
of course they are.
$1 cars and all
Of
this
course
kind of
they are.
stuff.
Yeah. And so, but if they were to finance that by taxes, they would have to say, okay, we're going to send each working American family a bill for $10,000 this year.
Right.
Then you'd see far fewer Ukrainian flag bumper stickers in America, I think, than you do now. If that, but when they can just print money, it's we don't see it. And when the inflation comes, when the gas prices go up, the government will blame Exxon. It won't blame its own money printing. And when the housing prices go up, it'll blame the home builders and the business people, and the economic educated among us, which is most people, will buy it. It's amazing. Always amazing to me how if you get dressed up in a nice suit and you stand in front of a bunch of American flags, people will believe almost anything you say. Most people. Yeah. There were even at least half of the voting population actually believes what Joe Biden says still. If you can imagine
And then
that.
the other half believes what Trump's going to say.
The other half believes whatever Trump is going to say. Yeah.
And it's like both the guys are
Yeah.
they're controlled and they have nothing. They can't do anything.
Yeah.
It's the hidden hand behind them that does it.
Yeah.
So when let's talk about that inflation for a moment. I know a lot of my listeners will understand this, but if I pull out of my safety deposit box my $20 gold piece that I inherited from my dad or was passed on and yeah, inherited. It was an 1887, whatever it was, or actually I got a 1882 silver dollar. So I have a silver dollar sitting in my deposit box. It's an 1882 that I got as a kid. If I go out today and I take that dollar and I take the silver, because it's all silver, and turned in the amount of silver, the value of that money would be the equivalent of what it was back in that day. And especially with the gold piece, that $20 gold piece would buy whatever it bought in 1890. You turn that gold in, and you will be able to buy the same thing you bought basically. And is that correct? Because I've looked at this and I'm like, oh, that gold piece worth $3,000, $4,000.
Yeah, gold is what, $2,300 an ounce, something like
Yes.
that. Yeah, by the ounce today. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's the hard, and people want you to buy gold, buy silver, and I'm like, well, okay, I get it for a hedge for part of it, but
Yeah.
the fact is that shows you that there's inflation. That that original 20 was 20. It's just that the
Yeah.
inflation is caused it to go from $20 to
Yeah.
$3,000.
Yeah. Well, the inflation over the year, the Fed was created in the year 1913,
Yep, Jekyll
and
Island.
there's one statistic that an economist recently looked up and wrote this in an article that if you a bunch of goods that you would have bought for $100 in the year 1913, the same things, just food, clothing, shoes, the stuff that we buy to live would cost $3,000 today
There you
because of all
go.
the inflation over the years, and since the Fed has been created, and it laughingly says that it was created to control inflation, and that's what they've done for us. And so, in addition to creating boom and bust cycles, the Fed was created in 1913. There was a Great Depression in 1920, and the unemployment rate was higher than it was the first year of the Great Depression of the 1930s. But the government at that point retrenched. Up until the 30s, the government response to depressions was cut taxes, put more money back in the pockets of the people, don't don't spend anymore, hold up on spending, don't borrow more, and that all changed in the 1930s. And the result was we had a 15-year long Great Depression, but the 1920 Depression lasts 1 year. And then the Fed turned around and did the same thing. They created a stock market bubble, and that burst in 1929. That led to the Great Depression. And then we've had, all the example after example of that, right up to the current day of these constant bubbles being created by the Fed creating too much money, stock market bubbles, real estate bubbles, all throughout our history since then. And so the Fed has made the American economy much more unstable than it was before we had a Fed, in addition to all the price inflation.
Now, if you take that what the Fed does, and then you look at what the how Wall Street has been used to leverage trillions of dollars of black money and money that's off the books, and the large investor organizations out there. I discovered that every city in the United States has a slush fund that's all invested in treasuries, bonds, and stocks.
Yeah,
And these slush funds in Washington state alone is worth over $319 billion. That's just their slush fund
yeah.
that's stashed over there, and they have to keep raising my taxes. And I'm like, you've got my local. I asked my local township, can you show me your books, your off books? It's called the
Yeah.
CAFR. And are you familiar with this? This
Uh,
thing going on that they call it the CAFR certified. I forget
Well,
what.
I'm not I'm not sure I'm familiar with that, but the first book that I wrote that was published in 1983 was titled "Underground Government: The Off-Budget Public Sector," and what it was about was how a co-author and I did a study of how American governments, state and local governments, responded to tax revolts in history, of which there have been many. And typically, what happens is the government would say, "Okay, we're going to put a limit on spending. We're going to put a limit on borrowing, or we're going to cut taxes." Okay, because they would have votes, and it'd end up in a vote, and there'd be a 3/4 of the votes would be for this, and the politicians would promise to abide by the vote, democracy in action. And then they would immediately set up what we called an off-budget enterprise that was funded by what are called revenue bonds, which do not require voter approval. So they would fund these bonds, and they would always make up some story of, well, we're going to make money some one way or another to pay off the principal and interest on the bonds, but it almost never works out that way, at least in the time period we studied. And so, and that's what we call the off-budget public sector. And at the time, it led to all sorts of catastrophes. It led to the bankruptcy of the state of New York in the 70s. In Washington state, there was the Washington Public Power Supply System in
Whoops,
the, in
that
the
was
80s.
whoops.
Whoops.
Yes.
And we had a whole chapter on whoops in this
First Bank,
book.
See
That was
First
one of
Bank,
these. That was an
a vendor.
off budget enterprise. The people did not want it. They did not want to build 5
No.
nuclear power plants in the Northwest. And so the politicians said, "Okay, we'll show you. We'll sell revenue bonds." And they brought George Mitchell as an advisor. Nixon's attorney general. And he was a bond salesman before he became attorney general for Nixon, and he invented what's called a moral obligation bond. It said the idea was, yes, this government, the taxpayers are not obligated to pay off these bonds, but the government has a moral obligation to find a way to pay off the
Which
bonds,
is you and I.
some way, yeah, which is the taxpayers, yeah, yeah, and so they called it that. And so they looked for moral advice from John Mitchell, the Wall Street bond shyster, and so that's how that worked. Oh yeah,
So,
that was a big debacle. They lost someone. What was it? Only one of the nuclear power plants that was ever up and running, and
yes, yeah, the rest of them, and
spent
it turned out
billions of dollars.
it
Yeah,
turned out it was they used faulty materials. They couldn't even get it running, even if they wanted to, because
yeah,
the materials were defective. The contractors were
yeah,
using crappy whatever. And
yeah,
yeah, so yeah, I remember that because Seafirst was the bank that funded it, and or they ran it through, and they went
yeah.
away. I in my town, Linwood, and that was a huge thing in the 80s. And yeah, so you had a bond salesman who ends up becoming the financial advisor for Nixon. You had a railroad lawyer who ends up becoming a president, and you have all these guys that sit on Wall Street and bankers that actually get appointed in all the government positions of today, and consequently they go from government to private to government to
Oh
private,
yeah,
and
yeah,
it's all benefiting their cronies. It's
yeah.
not benefiting you and I. It's
Mhm.
just so let's segue a little bit into who Mr. Mises was and how that you guys came along and formed an institute around him and what you're doing with that.
Yeah, what's Ludwig von Mises is his name.
Yes.
He was the preeminent academic critic of socialism and fascism of the 20th century. He was from Austria, which is why it's called Austrian economics, but it has nothing to do with the country of Austria. And von Mises was a big critic of German fascism and socialism, and he was Jewish. So he had to get out of Dodge when the Nazis took over. And he literally left his apartment. He was in Vienna, Austria, for a while. And then he went to Geneva, and he fled his apartment literally hours before the Gestapo came in and confiscated all of his papers. And he ended up in New York City. Eventually, he and his wife left with two suitcases, and he taught. And there were businessmen in New York who knew who he was. He's very famous at the time, and so they funded a position for him at New York University, where he taught until he died in 1973. And so he spent all those years, and he produced a lot of great students during that time. And he was, like I said, he was a preeminent critic of socialism. But this school goes back much deeper than that. The most famous Austrian school economist was Friedrich Hayek, who
Yes.
won the
Yeah.
Nobel Prize in 1974. He was a student of Ludwig von Mises, so he would have considered Mises to be his mentor
Enter.
as far as that good. And so the Mises Institute carries forward this tradition of scholarship, of private property, free enterprise, real capitalism, criticisms of crony capitalism and socialism and interventionism, and it's pro peace as well as anything, because war is the health of the state, and the state is what crowds out the civil society and private enterprise. And so, if you wanted to be a defender of the civil society and freedom in general, and not just free enterprise, but a free society, you have to minimize the state. And war is the health of the state. And so, we're not against defensive wars, but we haven't fought a defensive war in a very long time.
Since
And so
1812.
it makes sense. Yeah, maybe the War of 1812 was the
I think
last
that's
one,
it.
probably the last one. And so that's what we do. We publish books, we have conferences, we have a great website with free books. You can get a free economic education. Some of our books There's a book called Man, Economy, and State by Murray Rothbard that gets 30 or 40,000 downloads per month. Even von Mises books get that kind of downloads. A couple of months ago, there was a UFC fighter named Renato Moicano, a cage fighter. He wins a fight. He was a big underdog. He wins a fight. There was one of these big fights with tens of thousands of people there. Trump was there. Joe Rogan was the commentator. And after the fight, Joe Rogan has a microphone and he goes to interview Renato Moicano, the fighter. His face is all swollen and bloody, bleeding from the fight. Renato grabs the mic from Joe Rogan and said, "If you care about your country, you will read Ludwig von Mises." And he's just some guy from Brazil who had
Right.
been reading this stuff, the literature of freedom. And so we immediately sent Renato a big box of books and T-shirts and ball caps with Mises.org on it, and invited him to come and give a talk to a bunch of students here at the Mises Institute. And hopefully he'll accept our invitation to do that. And so yeah, so that's those are some of the things we do. You can get a great education by reading the articles for free, all these books for free that we have, and we have daily articles of all kinds. And on our website, I think it's the best economics website in the world as far as that goes. We started up a children's series of videos and books for kids. I have a colleague here who has three small children himself, and he's has a PhD in economics, and he's taken on the task of writing children's books and
Wow.
about economic literacy. And there was an old book called Capitalism for Kids by Harry Brown, not by Harry, but by Carl Hess. I'm sorry, Carl Hess. And the subtitle is How to Be Your Own Boss When You Grow Up. And I used to keep a box of those. And anybody I knew who had children, they were 10, 12, 13, I would give them a copy of this book, put the idea in your head. And a friend of mine, when I lived in Baltimore, had two young daughters. When they were 10 or 11, I gave them these books. And I didn't see them for years. When I saw the one daughter when she was 18 and going off to college, she comes up to me and said, You've changed my life. You gave me that book when I was 12. And I decided after reading that book, I wanted to be an entrepreneur like my mom. Her mom owns several print shops. And so you never know who you're going to influence, like in a good way with something like that. And so that's one of the things that we're starting to do more of.
I find it wonderful. So how do you get is it just by donations and then of course
Yes.
the sales of your content
Yes,
that
well,
you
it's
guys
been
create?
around for 42 years, and we have a list of basically it's about 700 donors, and a lot of them are very faithful. They donate money. We took out a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago with the title "Who Needs the Fed?" Because a donor who runs a manufacturing business in the Midwest said, "I would like to pay for a Wall Street Journal ad criticizing the Fed." So we wrote one up. He gave us the money. It was six figures to have a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal. It was on page A5 also, and a couple of weeks ago. And it's on our website. If you go to our website and on the search engine, type in "Who Needs the Fed," you'll see it. And not every donor is that generous. This is a
No.
very wealthy guy who gave us a lot of money for that. But that's we live on donations. We make a little money selling the books and in our conferences, but it's these great heroic people who want to support freedom. They're very generous, and they're fortunate in life to make money. We have a lot of people who give us $10 a month too, and you can join. You can be a member for $100 a year. You get discounts on all of our books and our T-shirts and sweatshirts and things that we sell, also. And you get a discount if you participate, come to one of our conferences. We hold conferences around the country during the year.
Oh, that
Uh, that's what we do.
I found you in Mrs. Mises through I found I've got this uh it's called Tactical Civics, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it might
Mhm.
be some
No,
I'll introduce you to that. I'll send you an email on this.
okay.
I've introduced two interviewed two people. You might want to listen to those interviews. Um, but they're going back and looking at how we as individuals, we the people, can take back control of our of the
Yeah.
government, utilizing what's there already in the Constitution.
Yeah.
But the point is, on the back of his book, he has like 50 different books, and he had a number of yours. And
Oh,
I said,
really?
I need to bring you on, and I've noticed I've got other
Okay.
people that are attached to
Yeah.
your institute. But I'm telling folks, go there. M E M
MISES.
E I MISES.org. There is a treasure trove of content there. And speaking of which, I like one of my themes on my show is peace, because as a follower of Christ, the Prince of Peace,
Yes.
it appalls me that Christianity has been so co-opted for so long to think it's okay to have a warring spirit. And I'm like, that is not of Christ. That is,
Yeah.
even if you go through the Old Testament and you go, when did God really sanction and what was the purpose versus they just wanted to do it? And you realize a lot of what is in history isn't according to what he wants, it's what we want. But talk to me about how we have, we've been brainwashed to honor service people, honor the military, make it big. You can always win when you write songs about mom, American pie, and the military, and the churches got the American flags in there and the Israeli flags and all this. And how and I don't know how religious you are, but it seems to me that that whole mindset of militarism is so
Yeah.
bred with, I mean, I'll just point this out. I worked hard to keep my boys, my sons from, well, actually only one of them was thinking of going into the military, and he went down, found out, and came home, and I went down a second time after talking to him, and I said to the recruiter, so tell me, if he signs up, he can be recruited and go anywhere around the world you need him, right? Yes. You will own him for the time he's in there. Yes. Okay, son, do we need to talk about this? Yeah, we do. Okay, thank you very much. And we went home and he
Yeah.
says, I don't want to be owned by anybody.
Yeah.
But talk to me about that, because you said war is the what? The lifeblood of a
The
state.
health of the state. Go online. There's a famous essay called "War is the Health of the State." And the other one I mentioned was "War is a Racket."
Yep, that's a good one.
Yeah, by Smedley Butler. "War is the Health of the State" by Randolph Bourne, Bourne. It was written around the World War I era, and it is brilliant. It's just a brilliant and eye-opening essay. It talks about how once people are convinced there's a threat, like and a war is coming, they become childlike and they want mommy and daddy to protect them, and
Yes.
mommy and daddy is the government now, and they will do whatever mommy and daddy say, we saw that during COVID. We had the
Yes.
same kind of a thing. It
Yes.
was turned into the Soviet Union overnight,
Yes.
and the people went along with it. And so, but you should read that essay. It's really eye opening. War is the health of the state. Yeah, it's disgusting. Some of the military people, the young guys and girls who join the military are nice people,
Mm-hmm.
but the problem is you have these despicable, disgusting human beings like Dick Cheney who are in charge of the military
Yeah.
and who can't get enough bloodshed. Who just There's just war after the neocons, war
Wolfowitz.
after war after war. And,
Chris.
and then you have the so-called evangelicals who think that the government of Israel today is the same as Israel of the Bible, which is, I think, nonsense. They
Nonsense.
really do. They think
They
it's,
do. I belong to a church that does
what,
that.
one of the smartest men I've run across in years is a man named Ron Unz, UNZ is how he spells his name. Look him up on the web. He writes these big long articles. He has a PhD in theoretical physics, so this is a smart guy. But he writes a lot about politics. He has convinced me in one of his recent articles that the people living in Palestine today, if there are descendants of the Israel of the Bible, that's where they are. It's the Palestinians who are he's read all these books on DNA and everything like that. And he convinced me that the actual descendants of the Israel of the Bible are the people who, not all of them, but the people who there. If you want to find them, that's where you're going to find them. And that the Israelis are imposters.
They're all they're
They're not
European.
they're Europeans. They're not have nothing to do with the Israel of the Bible. And but I've read this article and boy, it is researched, and it convinced me that this probably I think this is right. He has the right conclusion here. But
It, it,
maybe that's why they're trying to commit genocide in Gaza today, that to get rid of the real Israelis of the Bible.
it,
And,
it's this. I had a friend of mine, or my good friend and I, we talk about this, and he always tries to. He's like me. We don't support anything over there. And when a person starts, well, they that's their, and he'll stop. Everybody that's in Israel today they can trace their ancestry to European nations,
yeah,
Eastern Bloc countries,
yeah,
whatever. Those Palestinians can trace their ancestry back before Abraham.
yeah,
They were in that land.
yeah,
Those people are the people that were in that land,
yeah,
and they're still there. And they can trace their ancestry back generation to generation. The trees that get mowed over by the bulldozers from Israel, those trees
yeah,
have been in their families for 6, 7 generations,
yeah,
these olive trees. And
yeah,
it's insane. So it is that the whole dispensational mindset that took over in the 1800s, took over England first, came to
yeah,
America, and just engulfed everybody, has twisted the minds
yeah,
of evangelicals, and
yeah. It has. Yeah,
they
but
they, they can't think straight.
it's hard for me to find a Christian church that doesn't have American flags everywhere, especially on holidays. And so I consider my pastor to be Chuck Baldwin.
Oh
I don't know if
yes,
you've ever heard Chuck Baldwin.
I watch them.
I've been to Kalispell. He had a 10th anniversary celebration of his church, and he invited me to be one of the speakers to speak about one of my books at the 10th anniversary celebration. And so I listen to him online every Sunday
Yep.
in his sermons, and he's probably he's the best in explaining this that we're talking about right now of anybody I know of what has happened here and why we have what's going on in the Middle East today. Yeah,
Yeah,
he gave up his tax exemption too, so he's not afraid to speak truth.
I know he's part of the Liberty
Yeah,
Fellowship groups
yeah,
of churches.
yeah,
They're
yeah,
non 501, non 50C. Anyway,
yeah,
they're nonprofit. They're non-nonprofit, and it's interesting because I discovered him. I don't know, a couple of years ago, and I've been listening to him too. I still go to a big church, and
yeah,
they've got they got those flags sitting in the corner,
yeah,
and
yeah,
and
yeah,
and and I there are times when I have conversations in a men's group, and I'll just say, they'll say something, I'll say, no, that's not, and it's amazing how the spirit of an individual will literally change when that topic
yeah,
comes up. It's like, and I'll say, well, show me where Jesus told you to kill your neighbor.
yeah.
Okay, can you show me that?
Yeah, yeah,
And I,
they just want to please the government. Well, my wife and I used to belong to a church when we lived in Florida, and they had a Bible study group, and everybody emailed each other. And one woman had a son in Iraq, and she emailed the whole group and said, "Pray to kill more of the rats in Iraq." And
yes.
so we went to the minister and said, we can't have this. We can't have people saying pray to kill people in Iraq. And he defended it. He defended the email. And the only explanation for that I can think of is that they're scared to death of losing their tax exemption by criticizing what the government is doing. You never know who's going to show up from the IRS at the order of Joe Biden or whoever is in charge of the IRS at the time. Uh, and
It,
so
it
Yeah.
it's
So
interesting
we
because
never had anything to do with them after that.
no,
That's
I it's interesting because when that whole thing was going on way back and my kids were little, we would pray at night, and I would just say, Lord, I just pray that the enemy will come to know you.
Yeah.
and that people will lay
Yeah.
down their enemy, lay down their guns, and
Yeah.
serve you. That was my prayer.
Yeah.
I didn't have all that I know now, but I would say just, Lord, I just pray that they'll come to know you and that they'll lay down their enemy, that there won't be any need for war. There won't be need for that, but they'll just come to see Jesus. And then I'm finding out today there's whole books and there's whole movements that Muslims all over the world are having visions and God's talking to them. And I'm like, when was the last time that happened to Israelites? Well, or the Jewish
Yeah.
today. Yeah,
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
can't work with a hardened heart. But
Yeah.
it's so back to what you guys are doing. You have a whole different series of podcasts
Mhm. Yeah, we
and
have
historical
podcasts.
parts,
Yeah,
and
we
you've
have
got
something
books.
called Radio Rothbard as a weekly radio show.
Yep.
We have another podcast, and a lot of them are archived, so you can go on our website and listen to these podcasts. Very interesting topics of all kinds that are there.
So what
Uh,
one last thing before I let you go is you have written, and we've talked a little bit about that basically government and it was a buddy of mine several years ago we were talking. He says, Steve, governments are just syndicates. They're just crime syndicates.
yeah,
And I went, you're right. They say war on drugs when reality they're the ones that are bringing in the drugs.
yeah.
The CIA was involved with all the drugs from.
They're in business with Pfizer, aren't they?
Oh yeah, that's the legal
Yeah, yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
It's it's Vietnam. They're bringing it back, in the military's
yeah.
or the CIA is bringing back opium. In
Oh yeah,
Afghanistan, they're bringing back opium,
yeah,
and in if China's bringing the fentanyl. I'm like, the government is behind this. They want.
yeah,
Okay, I have a friend who has a ministry that they reach drug addicts on the street and try to get them in the detox,
yeah,
and over 100,000 people died last year
yeah.
of fentanyl
Yeah.
overdose.
Yeah. How much fentanyl do you think has been brought into the country since we had open borders? That's
That's what I'm
you,
saying. The
there's
government
nobody check.
is,
You could have your pockets loaded with this stuff and just walk right across the border, and no one will say anything. In fact, they'll give you a credit card and a free cell phone so you could contact your drug dealer wherever you're ending up.
if you,
And that's been going on for years now.
for years. So
Yeah.
the government doesn't care about, I'm convinced that they want to kill off as many Americans as possible, the low-laying fruit. They did it with the COVID
Yeah.
shots. They did it with the protocols in the hospitals under Fauci. They do it with the fentanyl. They do it with wars. I think there's a whole book called Deicide or Death by Government.
Demo side.
Democide.
Demo
Thank you.
side. Yeah. Yeah.
So just before we end, talk to me about your views on that, on government just really quite frankly not
Yeah, well,
caring.
government is just another criminal gang, but it's the biggest gang of all, the biggest gang of all. The mafia like a single ant compared to King Kong by comparison, as far as criminality goes. Taxation is basically theft. The government steals from one group of people, the productive people, and gives the money to unproductive people in return for their political support to make it create a facade of legitimacy for them. They rig the elections just in case they haven't bought enough votes as far as that goes. So one of my articles, by the way, I went down the whole list of the 7 deadly sins and made the case that every one of them is an inherent feature of a politician. Not every single politician, there are good ones like Ron Paul, I can mention, but basically in general, if you go down the list of the 7 deadly sins, now I call them showcases of the 7 deadly sins in their behavior, and not only criminality, but yeah, the government is a criminal gang. It has killed far more people. That every time we get a new president, they make a big deal out of the first time he murders somebody by ordering a bombing. We bombed over here, over there, wherever. Remember, Bill Clinton claimed that there was a terrorist training camp on the day that Monica Lewinsky was giving grand jury testimony that it had to be bombed. Turned out to be an aspirin factory, and
Yes.
so yeah, so they willy nilly just murder people all over the planet. And the mafia never had that kind of, or any organized crime syndicate ever had that kind of power.
And as a matter of fact, the mafia only took out people that were actually opposing them.
Yeah.
They didn't just they took care of the civilians quite
Yeah.
well
And
because
and they never dropped nuclear bombs on civilian cities either.
God, or millions and millions and millions of rounds
Yeah.
and fire and
Firebombing cities like Dresden. Yeah.
yeah, and everybody, they're all these governments do this.
Yeah.
They just
Yes, they do.
and then we get caught up, like you were saying, people get caught up in their brains get taken over
Yeah.
and and they're no longer able to think clearly. They're just put out there. And I tell people, please read War is a Racket. It is the
Yeah.
cleanest, about 35 pages.
Yeah. It's a pamphlet. Yeah.
And I want to circle around that for a moment. We got a couple more minutes.
Okay.
In the 20s, I've read a lot of literature. Even Napoleon Hill came out in that era and Bernays came out in that era, and um, and War is a Racket. And you just said that Unz or whatever the guy that
Ron Unz,
the
UNZ. Yeah.
War is the Health of the State.
Yeah. That's
That one,
Randolph Bourne. Yeah.
Born, and that was in that era. And it was like there was a whole America First
Yeah.
isolation. They call them isolations, but they were saying we just went through World War One. We saw what that was about. We don't want it again. And they saw that the machine was already cooking up another war,
Yeah.
and
Well,
they were
that's
getting
why we're constantly at war with somebody. That's why we have all the military worshiping. One war we pulled out of Afghanistan, in the worst possible way. And then what was it? A week later, where Ukraine comes up, the next
yes.
big war with war after war after war, and no wonder you got the great H.L. Mencken used to refer to some Americans as boobus Americanus. You call a bunch of boobs. And I don't know
Oh
if you know
gosh,
who H.L. Mencken was. He was a
no.
great journalist of the 20th century, and he would be known as a libertarian today, I would think. He's not a libertine. The so-called Libertarian Party is a bunch of libertines. They're not about freedom, really, from what I can tell. But Mencken was, and he used to refer to people that sort of the unthinking as bubus Americanus.
Oh my goodness, that's the guys that I know is that we call them the Great Unwashed. It's just like
Yeah.
they're uh, just going right along with. I talk about that in
Yeah.
my book. It goes back to ancient Israel, and God says, I don't want a king for you guys. I want you to have judges, and you take care of yourself. And they go, no, 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 no. We had a couple bad judges. Now we want a king. And he said,
Yeah.
fine. And here's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And he lists this list, and that was the blueprint of every government ever.
Yeah.
Is they,
Yeah. Rush Limbaugh called them low information voters on his radio show. Polite way of
but
saying stupid people. Yeah.
stupid
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Well, I want to close out and just say thank you so much. This has been wonderful and very educational for me. And folks, I want you to go over and visit mises.org. And I want you to look at Tom's work, Tom DiLorenzo. And there's a bunch of other great people on there that also write literature.
Oh yeah.
Um, just plug. I'm gonna let you plug yourself and plug your organization one more time before I sign out.
Okay, sure. Yeah, look up our website, Mises.org. You get a great education from it. In 2 weeks, we have about 120 students from all over the world coming here to spend a week in July in hot Auburn, Alabama, to sit in a room and listen to economics lectures for a week. And we get self-motivated. It's the best week of the year for me because I'm around these young people that are just wonderful. They're here to learn, and they don't get any course credit or anything for it. They're genuinely interested in learning, and that's what we do. That's what we love doing, and we strive to do more and more of it. Thanks to our very generous donors, where we're able to achieve these things here at the Mises Institute. And you can find any of my books on Amazon. I have an Amazon page, and you can look them up.
That is great. As a matter of fact, I'm going to look on there and see when your different conferences are, because maybe that'll be an
Sure.
excuse for my wife and I to fly out there and spend a little time and hang
Oh,
out with.
we have a big conference in Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, October 10th through 12th. We call it the Supporters Summit, and the theme is Our Enemy, the State. And so there's 2 days, not full lectures, 2 days, because
Right.
the audience is not academics. The speakers are, but the audience is not. Is real people, and it's at an Omni Resort right on the ocean and Hilton Island, and it's always a nice time. You make new friends and meet like-minded people, and we usually have well over 100, sometimes close to 200 people show up for
Wow.
that.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Tom, for coming on with us. And folks, I want to say thank you also for joining me. And remember, if you guys like my show, share it with all your friends. And as I like to say, be a lion and not the prey. And that will finish that.